Hey, what's going on? Welcome to the show Boundary Break. It's a show where we basically take the camera anywhere we want to try to find secrets and new discoveries to some of our favorite games. I'm your host, Shesez, and we're going to be talking about out of bounds stuff in Dead by Daylight today. Now, Dead by Daylight was a little more difficult to collect footage for because it constantly updates and it's an online-only game. But for what I was able to collect, there's still some worthwhile things to talk about here. And I want to thank Cranch and his crew for hooking me up with a camera tool, and I'll leave links to their stuff down below. But anyways, with that said, let's get going. So first thing that I want to acknowledge is that I know that there are multiple main menu screens for this game depending on which update you're playing. Unfortunately, I was only able to look at this one for now, but there is a lot to talk about. First of all, right behind the killer is a really cool developer tool left inside the game. It's 4 orbs and a cube. And what this object is meant to do is to test lighting on various types of objects and surfaces. It's a nice quick reference with multiple examples that can let the developer know if they have to change the direction of the lighting or the lighting itself. And anyways, right behind that is a black quad. Now for this, it's not as clear cut. It's likely that it was used as the loading screen. But what's really cool is that in between this and an area that we're going to talk about in just a second, there is a black cuboid with an untextured square on the cube. And thankfully Shmoyul had an explanation for this. And it's their thought that this is the old loading screen, one that got phased out in future updates where the logo would pulsate. Shmoyul remembers seeing this at one point and watching the untextured square pulsate just like that little texture would, and even recall at times that texture not loading incorrectly while playing the game and seeing the untextured square. And anyways, now let's talk about that giant mass of geometry over to the right of the loading screen. What could that possibly be? Well, it turns out it's the entire archives. Yeah, surprisingly, it's all loaded in at once, and we can explore this map here without too much in the way of that. And the person that's sitting in the seat showing off this object here in his hand is never shown from the front, which is really funny because if we take the camera around and take a look at it, it's a fully textured face but without eyes or a mouth. It's really weird because there's highly detailed skin across the face, just no other features beyond that. You can also see that he's wearing pretty casual clothing that doesn't really match up with his mutton chops that would kind of indicate that he's from a different era. Also, because you never get to see him from the front, you can see that his legs clip into his own chair. Now, of course, it's kind of fun to explore this room since you never really get a chance to, and I'm just going to hang the camera around here for just a little bit so you can get a better look at this stuff. But there is something more interesting to talk about on a developer level. The weird shelves that move up and down when you're in this area have a very funny function. If you pan the camera out, it becomes incredibly clear as to how this is pulled off. These shelves have chunks to them, and they basically run on a conveyor belt, and every single time that chunk's time is up, it gets pushed and shoved back, only to be pulled underneath the existing chunk that the player can see, so they can seamlessly continue the cycle. Unbeknownst to the player, that single object is constantly being reused. Alright, so let's talk about the killers for a bit. Now, I'll start with the tutorial area. Over at the end of this map is where all the characters are stored for this presentation, and then they get warped to where they're supposed to be. Now, while we have the trapper here, let's take the camera inside of his mask and show you what his face looks like. Now, this is how he looks like when you are the survivor, but what does he look like when you are the killer? And what I absolutely love about Dead by Daylight is that they use the character models that are for the third-person characters and then stretch all the things that would get in the way of the camera backwards in order to use that same model. In the case of the trapper here, you can see that his face gets stored outside of his mask, making it a lot easier to see his face. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for characters like the Legion and Oni or Kazan, but they do have faces underneath their masks. So let's take a look inside of each one of them. Here's a good look at one of the male Legion characters. That's pretty cool and everything, but there's also the face of the Huntress. The Huntress, however, has black eyes, so there's no amount of brightness and contrast boosting that you could do here to see what her actual eyes look like. They are in fact black. And thankfully the same cannot be said for Oni, who has regular eyes underneath, and they don't even match up to where his eyes would be on his mask, which that's not too surprising considering the fact that you're not even supposed to see his face. And frankly, with all the stuff that I find on Boundary Break, it's surprising to see that there's a face on any of these characters at all. I'm gonna guess it was meant to be an Easter egg left by the developers if somehow, some way you managed to clip the camera inside of their character models. But yeah, also the pig from the Saw series has a face. This character also features black eyeballs, but her actual face is pretty filthy. And you might notice that the lighting here is really good. Well, I wanted to make sure that it was well lit because normally this would be a lot darker. In fact, one of the best features we have for this episode is that we have a full bright command for the game. Dead by Daylight's a pretty dark game. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of comments down below about how it's too dark to see anything. If somehow they stuck by the video for this long, they can now take a look at some of these environments with full lighting. It's kind of insane to see how much detail there is to these objects and also just how much different it looks when you do turn on all the lights on all the objects. It almost looks like a completely different game. Anyways, taking the camera side of the twins' body can show you that Victor has a fully modeled body. There is some geometry though that gets poked in and poked through, but it's only distorted enough so it doesn't clip through Charlotte. And then there's Nemesis. Now, he's interesting because he has an idle animation here where a tentacle comes out of his hand. And someone on Twitter asked what it looks like when you take the camera inside of his hand when the tentacle is retracted. And anyways, there was a lot to look at here. Apparently, it gets turned into a giant flat donut, which is very surprising. In so many instances here, whenever something is out of sight, it usually just disappears in this game. But it's great to see old school techniques like this right here, where you can just see the entire geometry just collapsed inside of the hand. And now let's talk about one of the survivors. Now, I don't know why I didn't collect footage for this, but I did take pictures of it. There's a cameo character, Bill, from Left 4 Dead. And if you take the camera up to his cigarette, it has something written on it, and it's really hard to make out. So I asked people on Twitter what they think it was, and they extracted the images of the character model, as well as taking a deep dive into trying to sharpen the font, and people figured out that it says El Kirchmer Traditional, and it's believed to be a nod to Eric Kirchmer, who is a Valve artist. Alright, let's start talking about the stages. The first thing I want to talk about is the modern tutorial stage. Now you're going to notice that if you take the camera underneath this stage, you can see a cube as well as some lights. I'm not sure what the lights are about, but this area is heavily scripted, unlike the main game itself. And so these cubes are stored underneath here to basically write a trigger or a scripted code to allow the characters to set up and go into positions that they need to go to for the player to understand how to play the game. These floodlights that are attached to the generators, if you take the camera inside of them, you can find a bulb that's not seen by the player. This is because the casing for the floodlight is opaque. Also, that weird texture on the bulb is not on the other bulb, which might explain why they're opaque to begin with, because this one right here seems to look normal. And then staying on the subject light bulbs, if we take the camera inside of normal light bulbs, you can see that there's wiring inside. Once again, adding a detail to these light bulbs that don't need to be there because the player will never get to see it. There's even a screw for the light bulb, a fully functioning bulb essentially. So the hatches can show up at random spots on the map, and as a result, it's not static to the map itself. Taking the camera underneath can show you the entire box of the hatch object, as well as where the ground clips into the hatch. All this is covered up with a black smog effect. And although I couldn't get the HUD to disappear here, you can also see where the survivor stops when he jumps into the hatch, hanging just below it. Now there's a lot of environment here for the Raccoon City Police Department, but outside the boundaries you're just going to find a bunch of buildings. It's not really interesting, and honestly the details that are so minute and so hard to see are some of the more impressive things I found for this map. Like for example, when you go up to this Lexington typewriter, a staple of the Resident Evil franchise, you may notice that in the bottom right hand corner of this typewriter, the Umbrella Corporation logo happens to be there, which is the corporation responsible for making the viruses in the Resident Evil franchise. In the same room, here's a detail that you wouldn't be able to see. Taking the camera through this wall and looking at the side of the refrigerator can show you two notes that are slapped on the side, one of which is legible, saying buy bread and milk. And then I know there's a lot of cutoff areas on this map, and that's because this is pretty much a one-for-one recreation of the Raccoon City Police Department from Resident Evil 2 Remake. So here's an example of what some of those blocked off areas look like. Taking the camera up and over can show you that there's practically nothing up here, though textures are provided to give a full enclosure, which is kind of cool. This one's really random, but for this pull lever, there's a texture of the RPD star nestled inside the wall. And then we got the Thompson House here. Now there's something that's stored out of bounds. It's a couple of trash bags. Unfortunately, these trash bags are shown in various places throughout the game, so it's not a completely unused object. But these particular trash bags are completely unseen by the player. And at first I thought maybe the reason for this was because there would be flies floating around the trash bags, and that instead of seeing trash bags, you just see the flies clipped through the walls or something, which that's not the case. They're just completely unused. Going back for a moment to the main menu screen, by using Fulbright, you can see that the texture for the moon is in the shape of a square. Now for the early version of the tutorial, all the enclosures were pretty small, and whenever you were done with one objective, it would load you into a different part of the map. Unbeknownst to players though, all these areas are parallel to each other and masked with fog. And what's really cool is that if we keep panning out here, we can see an unused area. It's just some flat terrain with grass, but still all the same, it's surprising to see something that's not used at all. Now let's talk about some of the creatures in Dead by Daylight. Over here we have the rats. The rats seem to have orange eyes, which is very surprising, considering the fact that the rest of the creature seems pretty realistic looking. And over here we have a cockroach, and the detail to the cockroach is far beyond the detail that you usually see for insects in games like this. And why would that be the case? Well, panning the camera out here can show you just how small and insignificant it is in the grand scheme of things. But anyways, over here we got the crows, very common in this game, and the detail to them looks pretty great. Once again, following the theme of all the things we looked at so far, looking pretty realistic. But luckily, making my job a little easy here, we also have another creature. We have maggots that are fully 3D modeled, surprisingly, considering the fact that I've seen a model in the main menu that uses textures of maggots that looks comically cartoony. And then over in this stage we have buzzards, and the buzzards also look really good, except for the ones that are far off in the distance. This is a buzzard you'd never see up close, and so the developers never put in levels of detail to accommodate how close you are to the bird. As a result, you have this low poly buzzard that has the textures for its eyes cut off due to the low res texturing. And then you have the result screen here with the killer or the survivors running through an open plain. Now how this is pulled off is that apparently the killer will walk indefinitely in a certain direction, and loads of environment will appear in front of the killer, as well as disappearing when it's far beyond the fog and outside of the camera angle. Now where this is placed, I was surprised to find out, is still within the map of the level. The indication of this is that if we turn the camera upwards, we can see that it's stored far down below the stage, because you can still see the highlighted traps of the trapper and where all those would be placed on the original map. And sorry to cut it short, but that's all I got for now. Again, this episode was a little difficult to pull off because there is no offline mode and the game constantly updates, removing content that was once there before. But I want to thank everybody involved that made this episode possible. And if you're new here and you want to see some more content that's similar, I recommend the Resident Evil 8 episode. Seems to be a fan favorite of all the Dead by Daylight fans that I happen to know. But anyways, if you're going to Too Many Games, I hope to see you there. And outside of that, thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.